Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today, Sraddhalu will continue on Siddhis, and I guess there will be a lot of questions to be answered.
Yes, thank you, Narad. We have a few questions from last time also, but I thought it will be good to continue with the topic first with Sri Aurobindo's text, and then we will go to the questions. The theme title for today is Use of Siddhis. And Sri Aurobindo tells us what is it that makes the Siddhis useful in the context of the integral yoga, and what are the limitations which might lead to misuse, and what are the things one has to do to protect from them. But to recapitulate, last time we began with exploration of Sri Aurobindo's writings, particularly in the Record of Yoga, where we get a glimpse of his own inner life, his own sadhana, and certain amazing personal experiences which validate, demonstrate what he was doing and what was happening in his own sadhana in the very early stages. We began with themes rather than looking at the entire framework of the sadhana that we have already spoken of, drawing from passages of Sri Aurobindo in his personal diary notes called the Record of Yoga. And he describes there the 8 siddhis, which perfections, attainments, which are abnormal and outside the range of our capacities in the normal human life, and how they function, what they are, how they function. And then we read of a few examples of Sri Aurobindo's own early experiences of these kinds as he was working with the groups around him and on objects, animals, creatures around him. And remember, those were very early. Later we will see examples of what his larger work and the real nature of his action in the world was. In the theme we will take today, and I've put the link already for that, Sri Aurobindo describes the bigger picture of siddhis, their justification, their dangers and use. That's the subtitle. And I will read from his text and draw upon examples as we proceed. Sri Aurobindo writes, the 2 first chatushtayas of the Adhara have reference mainly to the central principle of man's existence, the Antahkarana, the inner being. You will recall this in the structure of the integral yoga and the 6 limbs, the 7th being a preparation of purification. The first limb was the foundation of equality. The second limb was the amplification of the power of the divine energy working in us. And then, so both of these have an effect internally within us. And then he says, but there is one superior faculty and one inferior instrument which have each their peculiar siddhi. So 2 things. Apart from this inner, we have a superior faculty which is of ranges of consciousness above, and the inferior instrument which is our body, physical body. He's referring to these 2. And so the 3rd and the 4th of the limbs of the yoga relate to these 2. Each has its own peculiar siddhi, perfection, attainment. The Vijnana, or supra-intellectual faculty, and the body. The siddhi of the Vijnana and the siddhi of the body belong, both of them, to that range of experience and of divine fulfillment which are abnormal to the present state of humanity. So straight away you see, the first preparation is of the inner ranges of consciousness which are well within the band of that in which we live subjectively. But our consciousness in which we live is a very narrow band. There are ranges above, ranges below. Typically, what is above we call superconscious. Typically, what is below we call subconscious. In the current Western psychology framework, there is no superconscious. There is only subconscious or unconscious, and they do not even have the conception, except some people now picking up these ideas from Sri Aurobindo. But broadly, the entire idea is anything which is conscious is a little bit, everything else is unconscious. That's how they look at it. In the yoga, though, there is much more complex, and in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, even more complex structure. Superconscious is what is above, subconscious is what is below, and there is the inner range, which is what he calls subliminal. It is in the same band of our current consciousness of mind, vital, and even to some extent physical sensations, which are extension of the mind, but at a range and capacity which is far greater hidden behind. So the first two chatushtayas, the limbs of the integral yoga, deal with this domain. The next one deals with the higher, the vijnana, which is superconscious to us. And the fourth one deals with the physical body, which strictly speaking, shorn of the mind awareness which normally carries it, is largely subconscious to us. And because anything developing of these two ranges is not in the normal domain, well, it is called abnormal. So the Siddhi of the Vijnana and the Siddhi of the body belong both of them to the range of experience and of divine fulfillment which are abnormal to the present state of humanity. You could go back to a point where in the previous Satya Yuga, there was a higher opening in large parts of humanity, and one could have had at that point a sense of the normal to some of these higher experiences. And going forward, maybe in a few centuries, there will be large parts of humanity in whom the intuition and maybe something even greater would be reasonably stable, that they will look back at our phase currently in humanity and say, oh, that was the animal period of humanity. Oh, those people, they were not even basically awake to such wonderful normal capacities that all should have, etc. So, abnormal to the present state of humanity. These are called specially Siddhis because of their abnormal nature, rarity, and difficulty. So they're not normal, meaning abnormal. They're rare and they're difficult to our current approach or capacity. They are denied by the skeptic and discouraged by the saint. Interesting. So those who are materialistic will say such a thing doesn't exist. The saint, who might have an experience of this, will actually discourage it. And you will see largely all over the literature, spiritual literature, they will say, oh, shun these, avoid these, etc. Why? Because there's a trap, you can get lost, you will get into some egoistic position, etc. But we'll see what Sri Aurobindo says, which is quite remarkably different. The skeptic disbelieves in them and holds them to be impostures, fables, or hallucinations, as a clever animal might disbelieve in the reasoning powers of man. So he's giving the analogy of an inferior grade of evolution. And if those animals were to look at the human being and it looks like human beings are able to do something which looks like reasoning power, they'll say, no, it cannot be. This is just by chance, or whatever way they'll cover up to themselves. We human beings, when we see a human being who has a little bit of that developed, we say that cannot be. The saint discourages them because they seem to him to lead away from God. He shuns them just as he shuns the riches, power, and attainments of this world, and for the same reason. So Sri Aurobindo has put these in the same category from the perspective of the saints as riches, powers, and attainments of the world. So in the ascetic tradition, they will keep telling you, well, money will take you away from God. Power will take you away from God. Enjoyments of any kind generally will take you away from God, etc. Why? Because in the ascetic path, the starting point is God is away from the world. There is a separation of the two. To get to God, anything that connects you further to the world or binds you in the world's processes would be a trap and would necessarily take you away because God is away from world. If on the other hand you see God immanent with the world and world itself as an evolutionary unfoldment of God's potential, then riches, powers, enjoyments, attainments, capacities, including siddhis, would be inevitably the outcome of this unveiling and unfolding of God's powers in us and in the world, isn't it? So the perspective changes because God has been separated from the world, and the goal is to go away from the world, therefore. The moment you see God and world together and world itself as a fulfillment or in a process of fulfillment of God, the relationship changes. So Sri Aurobindo says simply, we need not shun them and cannot shun them because God is sought by us in his world fulfillment as well as apart from the world. And in the world, these are the riches of his powers and knowledge which we cannot avoid once we dwell in him, perceiving and sharing his nature. So straight away, we're seeking God and the emergence and the fulfillment of God in the world, but also outside the world. We want to know him in his totality. But in the part of him that is fulfilling in the world, these powers are a part of his fulfillment. So there's an aphorism of Sri Aurobindo which touches upon this. I jump to the little booklet, Thoughts and Aphorisms. You will see number 86 aphorism. Sri Aurobindo writes, great saints have performed miracles. Greater saints have railed at them, shouted, abused miracles or performers of miracles. The greatest have both railed at them and performed them. Interesting. So three categories of saints. The great ones, they perform miracles. Greater ones shout against them. The greatest shout against them and perform them. And it's one of those things where you're required to pause and question why. And that introspection will open the gates to understanding the right relationship. Why to avoid and why to utilize and when. The mother, in her commentary on this particular aphorism, makes this observation that Sri Aurobindo performed miracles, but mostly he performed them in the domain of the mind, not in the vital and the physical. And the reason she gave was that when you intervene to create a miracle on those levels, very often there's some kind of mixture or distortion. I'm tempted to read, so if you don't mind, I will make a digression, then we'll come back to the text of Sri Aurobindo. In this commentary on this very text, and the discussion of the mother is dated 6th of March, 1963, 6th of March. And after reading this, somebody asked the mother, why don't you or Sri Aurobindo make a greater use of miracles as a means of overcoming resistance in the external human consciousness? Why this kind of self-effacement where outer things are concerned? This non-intervention or discretion? Good point. Please perform a miracle, then you'll have larger masses coming and maybe results also in people, isn't it? So, mother's comment. As for Sri Aurobindo, I only know what he told me several times. People give the name of miracle only to interventions in the material or the vital world. And these interventions are always mixed with ignorant and arbitrary movements. So you see, if a physical object, iron bends, something dematerializes or moves from one place to another, etc., it's a miracle. If in the vital there's an intervention, suddenly there's a shift of a certain state, or you demonstrate a great power, great influence, charisma, drama, that's a miracle. But when something's done in the mind, what do you call that? This is the point she makes. But the number of miracles that Sri Aurobindo performed in the mind is incalculable. But naturally, you could only see it if you had a very straight, very sincere, very pure vision. A few people did see it. But he refused this I know, he refused to perform any vital or material miracles because of this mixture. Now, what is this miracle in the mind? You remember last time we read from a few portions where Sri Aurobindo spoke of intervention of internal states of the disciples and imprinting or infusing yogic states in them. That effectively is a miracle, isn't it? If you take a physical object, suddenly make it glow and become bright, or make it hot or cold, or make it move, you say miracle. If you take now substance of mind, suddenly make it glow with intuition, bright with intuition, infused with light of intuition, isn't that a miracle also? If in a mind which is dull and incapable, unintelligent, you bring into it and awaken intelligence and make it brilliant, sharp, creative, even of a genius grade of capacity of creation, that is a miracle. We took the example last time of the dog. Sri Aurobindo described how he removed a layer of inertia and allowed the soul capacity, soul potential of the dog to come forward. And it began to do things which were uncharacteristic of it, and perhaps even generally of dogs. That thing done to human being, or the something in that direction, and we have spoken of this many examples before. Given the most common which I have referred to you was the example of Romain Palit. Narad, do you remember him? You might recall this man, if you remember something of him. He suddenly becomes, with no prior capacity, he suddenly becomes a poet, musician, artist, writer, and an extraordinary intellectual development of mind. And that is a miracle. Suddenly you've bypassed the human capacity and brought a genius potential just like that, woken it within 2 years. And Sri Aurobindo points to this when explaining to Nirodharan the power of the yoga force. He doesn't say, I did it. He says the yoga force, this is the effect of the yoga force. But where did the yoga force come? Why did it direct to him for this outcome? Well, it was Sri Aurobindo. So Mother says the number of miracles that Sri Aurobindo performed in the mind is incalculable. And then she continues, my experience is that in the present state of the world, a direct miracle, material or vital, must necessarily take into account a great many elements of falsehood that are unacceptable. They are necessarily miracles of falsehood. Mother is saying, my experience. Remember, Mother also had all these capacities. She also used them. We have seen examples last time and many times, many others before, when necessary. But her experience after all these years is this, that when you intervene on those levels in a direct way, material or vital, there are great elements of falsehood that are unacceptable, which accompany or blend in and mixing with those events. They are necessarily miracles of falsehood, and they are unacceptable. I have seen what people call miracles. I saw many of them at one period, but this gave a right of existence to many things which to me are not acceptable. What men call miracles nowadays are almost always performed by vital beings or by men who are in contact with vital beings. And this is a mixture. It accepts the reality of certain things, the truth of certain things that are not true. And this is the basis on which it works. So that is unacceptable. Now, by here she is referring to the large part of what passes as miracles. You've heard of God-men, saints, etc., who materialize, dematerialize, influence, transmute things, etc. Largely, it is done by a contract with vital beings who do it for them. They don't actually do it. And the vital being does it in return for something. And it only increases the rule of the vital world and the lower vital beings in the physical. And so the miracle itself is not a true miracle from a spiritual point of view. It is only application of vital being influences in the physical world. Very crude and coarse and harmful to the spiritual. The questioner asks, I did not quite understand what you meant by saying that Sri Aurobindo performed miracles in the mind. Mother explains. I mean that he used to introduce the supramental force into the mental consciousness. Into the mental consciousness that governs all material movements, he would introduce a supramental formation or power or force, which immediately changed the organization. This produces immediate effects which seem illogical because they do not follow the normal course of movements according to mental logic. He himself used to say that when he was in possession of the supramental power, when he could use it at will and focus it on a specific point with a definite purpose, it was irrevocable, inevitable. The effect was absolute. That can be called a miracle. So she'll give examples, so we'll wait for her to do that. For example, take someone who was sick or in pain. When Sri Aurobindo was in possession of this supramental power, there was a time when he said that it was completely under his control. That is, he could do what he wanted with it. He could apply it where he liked. Then he would apply this will, for example, to some disorder, either physical or vital, or, of course, mental. He would apply this force of greater harmony, of greater order, the supramental force, and focus it there, and it would act immediately. And it was an order. It created an order, a harmony greater than the natural harmony. That is, if it was a case of healing, for example, the healing would be more perfect, more complete than any obtained by ordinary physical and mental methods. There were a great many of them, but people are so blind, so embedded in their ordinary consciousness that they always give explanations, quotes. They can always give an explanation. Only those who have faith and aspiration and something very pure in themselves, that is, who truly want to know, they were able to perceive it. When the power was there, he even used to say that it was effortless. All he had to do was apply the supramental power of order and harmony, and instantly the desired result was achieved. There's more. The person asks, what is a miracle? Because Sri Aurobindo often said that there are no miracles. And at the same time, he says in Savitri, for example, all is miracle here and can by miracle change. Mother. That depends on how you look at it. From this side or that. You give the name of miracle only to things which cannot be clearly explained or for which you have no mental explanation. From this point of view, you can say that countless things that happen are miracles because you cannot explain the how or the why of them. I come back to the previous point where Mother said that people saw these and then explained it away because it didn't suit them. You will remember I had narrated a few months ago this incident where the mother cured completely the extreme condition of tuberculosis of a lady in the ashram, Shirin. And Shirin's tuberculosis was so bad when they had taken the chest x-ray, it had completely darkened in the lungs. The whole structure inside was full of the tuberculosis infection. She would not have survived. That's when Mother asked for her to be brought. And she was so weak she couldn't get up from her bed. They had two young men carry her on a stretcher, bring her to the mother's room. And you will remember the description which was I had shared from Vasanti, where Mother held her hand above Shirin's body and swept from all the head to feet. Slowly, removing, erasing, dissolving, dematerializing, if you want to use that term, completely the illness. And after it was completed, Shirin was sent back. She recovered from that condition. And then, of course, the doctor took her for another X-ray. When they took a new X-ray, the lungs were completely clear and normal. What did the doctor do? Instead of saying, wow, miracle, the doctor said, oh, it looks like our equipment failed. The previous X-ray which we took was a failure of the equipment. Shirin was always fine. She had no tuberculosis. Imagine the sheer stupidity of the medical mind which cannot accept this and has to say it made a mistake in the first. You had the X-ray still. It was visible, and yet he says, oh, it's the equipment which failed. But this is so common, and even in the ashram, even among devotees, that There's a point where you actually question whether it was worth it even to make that intervention. Imagine what happens to the mother when the doctor and the people around who go to the mother and say, "Oh, mother, by the way, you know that person you had tried to heal, it was not necessary. She was fine. She never had a sickness." And imagine what mother would have thought of this ungrateful humanity. Well, we continue. Question someone asks, what would be a true miracle? I can't see what a true miracle can be because, after all, what is a miracle? A true miracle? Only the mind has the notion of miracles because the mind decides by its own logic that given this and that, another thing can or cannot happen. But this represents all the limitations of the mind because, from the point of view of the Lord, how can there be a miracle? Everything is Himself, which He objectivizes. So, seeing from above. And so she continues. I skipped that portion where she describes how the universe is expressed, objectified by the Lord. She says, if you look at it this way, for a universe, a miracle would be the sudden intrusion of something from another universe. Or, Sri Aurobindo puts it, in influence of a truth of a higher plane operating on a lower plane. That's a miracle. And for the earth, this reduces the problem to something very understandable. A miracle is the sudden intrusion of something which did not belong to the earth. It produces a radical and immediate change by introducing a principle which did not belong to this physical world of earth. One could say that the sense of miracle belongs only to a finite world, a finite consciousness, a finite conception. It is the sudden entry, the intrusion, the intervention, the preparation, penetration without preparation of something which did not exist in this physical world. So obviously, any manifestation of a will or a consciousness which belongs to a domain that is more infinite and more eternal than Earth is necessarily a miracle on Earth. But if you leave the finite world, the understanding of the finite world, miracles do not exist. The Lord can play at miracles if it so amuses Him, but there are no miracles. He plays every possible game. So there's more. Maybe I'll put this link also. It is not there already. I will put it later. And the important point I want to highlight when the mother says that Sri Aurobindo made miracles all the time in the mental domain, and most people could not see. And there, when he utilized that supramental power, it was absolute and perfect in its outcome. And there's another passage where the mother describes, that's in the agenda, whenever Sri Aurobindo did an intervention like this, sometimes she would see that a person had a problem and she's in conversation with the person. Sri Aurobindo's hand, subtle hand, would come and place a drop of his consciousness, and instantly it would just create this perfect order. Imagine that happening in the physical world, you would call it a miracle. In the mind, you don't realize what it is because you do not see mind for what it really is. But instantly it would create this order. So there in that passage, the mother describes how when this kind of intervention took place, one drop of the supramental, the nature of the intervention was such that its effect would be large because the supramental is an infinite consciousness. Second, that the effect would be spontaneous, almost seeming to be effortless and inevitable. And looking back, it would look like you would say, oh, it must have happened. There's no way it could have been avoided. Although it bypassed all the chain of logic. The spontaneity and the large scope of its intervention, these are characteristic of that kind of intervention of the supramental force. When you look back at one of the major events, which was the sudden breakup of the Soviet Union, it was one such intervention, where suddenly the mind in the people, in the collective consciousness suddenly flipped, and there everyone said, yes, of course it has to finish. You look back and say, yes, of course it should have happened. There's no way it couldn't happen. So this is what they say. You'll notice the question was asked, why don't you, Sri Aurobindo and the mother, intervene with miracles more often? And the mother speaks about what Sri Aurobindo said. She says nothing about herself. It's interesting. And for several reasons. Think about it. But I come back now to the text we were reading of Sri Aurobindo. It was a digression. We come back to the text where Sri Aurobindo said that the skeptics disbelieves, the saints discourage because they seem to him to lead away from God, but that's because of your conception of God being separate from world. And then Sri Aurobindo says, we need not shun them and cannot shun them, the Siddhis, because God is sought by us in His world fulfillment as well as apart from the world. So we want to experience the reality of the divine consciousness in ranges of the higher ranges which are not yet manifest in the world. But we also want the divine consciousness to be fulfilled here. And when it is fulfilled, these powers are His powers. So how can you say that we will not accept the Siddhis because they are His powers operating in the world? And in the world, these are the riches of His power and knowledge, which we cannot avoid. Once we dwell in Him, perceiving and sharing His nature, in you grow in consciousness with Him. You cannot avoid the fact that what is natural to Him becomes natural to you. And if it is in His consciousness to experience the reality of everything that's happening in the world, when you dwell in Him, you experience the same. You experience what He experiences. The whole world is in you, and you're aware of what is happening. And when you're aware, you also are able to intervene. Because that's His nature, it becomes your nature. Indeed, there is a stage reached by the yogin when, unless he avoids all action in the world, he can no more avoid the use of the siddhis of power and knowledge than an ordinary man can avoid eating and breathing, unless he wishes to leave his body. So it's as natural as eating and breathing. It's even a requirement for your bodily survival. Of course, if you don't do that, you leave the body. But the same applies from the yogin's perspective when he's in that consciousness of immersion. You can't avoid the siddhis of power and knowledge unless you decide to have no action at all. For these things are the natural action of the vijnana. Vijnana here is this higher faculty. Generally, we will use the word supermind, but anything above the mind. The plane of ideal consciousness to which he is rising. Even if you have not reached that, the fact that you're rising towards it already in the gradations as you approach, its effects begin. To which he is rising. Just as mental activity and mental motion are the natural action of man's ordinary life. So if you had a mind, you would have the reasoning power. If you have the intuition or the higher ranges further, you have the faculties natural to those states. All the ancient rishis used these powers. All the great avatars and yogins and vibhutis, from Christ to Ramakrishna, have used them. Nor is there any great man with the divine power, at all manifest in him, who does not use them continually in an imperfect form, without knowing clearly what are these supreme faculties that he is employing. So find any great man with a little bit of the manifestation of divine powers, and you will find an imperfect use of these powers. If nothing else, he uses the powers of intuition and inspiration, the power of Ishita, which brings him the opportunities he needs, and the means which make these opportunities fruitful, and the power of Vyapti, by which his thoughts go darting and flashing through the world and create unexpected waves of tendency both around him and at a distance. So we'll look at a little bit at this sentence because there's something important here which is being described. If nothing else, so coming to a minimum of operation, find any great person in which a little bit of the divine power works in him. So you don't have to be spiritually greatly developed. Even an accomplished businessman who has something of the divine power working, not necessarily consciously in him. Now look at this person and you see. He uses the powers of intuition and inspiration. First, without intuition, without some inspiration, you cannot have any kind of meaningful success in the world. I'll put it another way. Anyone who has a little bit of intuition or inspiration will begin to have successes. depending, of course, what form it takes, but still. Because the nature of life is such high uncertainty, such conflicting, contradictory knowledge and information, that without a little bit of intuition, you can't cut through. You cannot organize, create anything worthwhile without something that shows you the way forward in all this confusion. So, minimum, you have intuition and inspiration. And what else? Minimum, the power of Ishita. Remember, these are the terms which we had discussed last time. Ishita is that power by which whatever you need, without you putting consciously a will, the fact that you need will provoke a certain influence by which the things tend to happen to assist you to fulfill that need. So, the power of Ishita, which brings him the opportunities he needs and the means which make these opportunities fruitful. So let's take an example. Here is this person with great business potential. Set aside the spiritual for now. Here's a person with great potential in business. If you were to give him some basic money, opportunities, give him a chance. Hey, okay, you take over, take a look at this, see if you can, or build something, whatever. But he needs the opportunity to come his way. How does that happen? Think about how hard some people try just to have an opportunity. And then there are people who seem to be gifted. They need an opportunity and the opportunity literally comes their way. And you might say, and this is how it's often described, when you are ready, the circumstances will come your way. Yes, but why? How does that work? And it is this power of Ishita. The fact that here is a magnet which has the power to attract, to move, to make things happen, the radiation of its magnetism already starts pulling things at a distance. When such a person sets his mind, says, okay, now I've had enough of sleeping, I'm going to get up and do something about it. And that intention already, without putting a specific will, suddenly doors open, he meets people, people come his way, and the gates seem to open. This is power of Ishita, which brings opportunities and the means to make the opportunities fruitful. In more material terms, conventional terms, this is what we call luck. And you find certain people just seem to have all the luck. Or in more crude but ignorant terms in the business world, they will say, nothing succeeds like success. In other words, when you're successful, the success triggers more success. Elon Musk is a great example of that. But it feels as if, oh, success is chasing him. No, but there's something huge happening behind which attracted the success or the circumstances which would make success possible in the first place. And when he fulfilled those circumstances and made something worthwhile, it triggered for more and more and more. So all these ideas, nothing succeeds like success, is a ignorant transcription of a deeper truth. Luck is just blindness by which you do not see what is behind. So, in fact, is this power of Ishita. Now, the Ishita power you may have yourself, you may invoke it, or it may be granted to you. This is where so many business people become religious or even sometimes superstitious. They have this idea, oh, when I associate or if I associate with an unlucky person, I will lose my luck. Because his, let's say, negative Ishita might affect my positive Ishita. They're not conscious, but just instinctively, intuitively, they feel that. And they want to associate with other successful people as if to not get rubbed by the wrong person. And there's a truth in it. I'll share an example. It's somewhat confidential, so I will not say any names. There's a friend of mine who was being vetted for a very high position, like at the top of a very big company, which belonged to a particular group and a family-owned group. I won't say more than that. So he went through all the chain of vetting, verification. Last stage, everything was done. He was basically accepted. The last stage, the family group asked to meet him personally. He goes to their house. They say, you have passed everything. We want to hire you, but we just have one last check. What was the check? So one member of the family told another member, look him up, check him out. This other member comes to him and says, sheepishly embarrassed, please don't mind. I'm going to look at your palm. So he looks at his palm, analyzes, and then with great joy, he tells the other family member, oh, this man is going to get you a lot of money. And there it was done, it was decided, he was hired. Interesting. I found that fascinating. It's a very successful group in that sense, but the family had this as the last vetting. Is this man actually capable of attracting wealth? Does he have wealth fated? That was the idea. So why don't they say, oh, you are capable, you will do it anyway? So underlying is not merely a physical skill capacity, but this power to be able to attract wealth itself. I have a larger discussion on this topic if you want to look it up. The talk was called Money, Power, How It Works and Why It Doesn't. It was given some 20 years ago. But we discussed along the lines of what Sri Aurobindo had to say about the nature of wealth. But the power of Ishita is what brings the opportunities and the means to make the opportunities fruitful. If that is there, the person says, I desperately need this to set this right, this situation. Starts looking around. Obviously, you don't sit idle. You start looking around, but just looking through 5 or 6 different directions, pop, 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 the opportunities come your way. If he buys a lottery ticket, he's more likely to win. Look at the contrary situation where somebody says, oh, I'm waiting for the luck to happen. God will give me luck. There's a story which goes like this. The person says, God, please, I'm praying every day. Why don't I win the lottery? Well, after a long time, and finally, you modify the story as you want. He dies, goes to God, or eventually God appears. He asks, I prayed so much. Why didn't you get me to win the lottery? And God says, but you didn't buy a ticket. That's the difference between the opportunities coming to you and the means to make the opportunities fruitful. So even if there is wealth coming, if you don't make that effort, the wealth cannot get the chance even to enter into your pocket or account. So there's an example here that the mother, which was narrated by Udarda, that the mother had, regarding a particular person who wanted to come from the United States to the ashram, the mother told Udar, tell him to bring $1 million. And that person, having got the message, mother said, bring $1 million. He says, hey, where will I get $1 million? I don't know anything. He didn't come. So after a few weeks or months, mother asked Udar, what happened to that man I said to bring $1 million? Udar said, oh, that man said, I don't think I have $1 million. I can't bring it. So he didn't come. Mother said, oh, what a pity, because I saw $1 million waiting to come and he was the chosen instrument for it. Now, if that man had a little bit of faith, he would have said, okay, mother has said it. Let me ask around. Let me try. And had he simply started the process, the thing which was waiting would have found the linkage to connect and it would have come. There's an example which was narrated to us. You would have heard of a very famous cinema producer named Tarachand Barjatia. I think his children are still in the film industry now. But at one point, he was quite famous. He had many successful movies. And he was a devotee. He would come to the mother for the first time as a businessman. He's looking for blessings to get more money. But something in him was open enough that he received that help and his film was a success. So he attributed it, he was conscious, he attributed it to the mother. So subsequently, every movie that he made, he would put a large photograph of the mother dedicated to her and then launch the movies. And at one point, I was told that when the movie was launched and it was not making enough money, he would send a message to the mother, it's not making enough money, please send your blessings. And the very next day, the sales would shoot up. And again, if it dropped, he would send a message, mother would intervene, and again the sales would shoot up. Now, here is a power being applied from outside by the mother on a person who is a reasonably good instrument, and she is able to intensify or enhance that particular power. But it's coming from her, and he's conscious, and so as a receptive instrument, it's able to act in him more easily. So, I'm coming back to the sentence. If nothing else, he uses the powers of intuition and inspiration, the power of Ishita, which brings him the opportunities he needs, and the means which make these opportunities fruitful, and the next, the power of Vyapti, by which his thoughts go darting and flashing through the world and create unexpected waves of tendency both around him and at a distance. So, Vyapti, you will remember the two powers of knowledge, Vyapti and Parakamya. So, Vyapti is that power by which you feel the impact of things outside as if hitting you, entering you, or your own influence reaches into them and affects them, but without you putting a specific intention or a specific focus of will. Prakamya is when you intervene and project a specific concentration of attention to a person to sense what is happening in them or to modify their state. So in Vyapti, you receive what happens, but also you influence modifying, but not with that specific focus of will. So Vyapti would be a state in which, without you intending, wanting, simply this poise in which you hold, you feel what happens, but also you impact circumstances. So the power of Vyapti, fourth thing, by which his thoughts go darting and flashing through the world. So he's thinking of this, I need to create this, I'm going to achieve this. Build the electric car, build this Starlink system, go to Mars. Just today, if you ask yourself one question, who in the world to you represents most the ideal of going to Mars? It's Elon Musk. There's nobody else. Just this one intention, this one ideal, this mission he set for himself, going back 15, 20 years that he's been speaking about it, when he did not have the means, the technologies. Humanity didn't have the means and technologies. But he set himself on that mission, built the technologies, built the means, and it is expected next year, he says, that his rocket will take a fully functional human-like robot onto Mars, and that robot there would be able to walk like a human being. Let's say it doesn't happen in 2026, maybe it takes another year, 2027. Worst case 2028, but it's going to happen because he not only built the rockets, he's built the robot and the AI and everything necessary to fulfill this. But the power of that one intention and thought which he holds, and he's not even saying, I want to influence humanity. He holds it. That, now you read Sri Aurobindo's description, the power of Vyapti by which his thoughts go darting and flashing through the world. One man, through the world. And creating unexpected waves of tendency, both around him and at a distance. So when that thought goes, it evokes tendencies in people. Unexpected waves of tendency, around him and far away from him. Now, if you look back 20 years ago, there would be a few children who, as they were growing, would have read this. Oh, he's speaking of going to Mars. I would like to be one of the first astronauts. I would like to work on a mission which would send something to Mars. 20 years later, that child is now a technical engineer, and somehow that thought had touched him enough that his entire career has been molded somehow with that underlying influence, tendency, which as he now comes into his own as an engineer, somehow it says, I want to work in SpaceX with Elon Musk or to fulfill that mission to Mars. So the fact that this person held this intention triggered movements which ripple and over a few years unfold and bring the opportunities and means creating those tendencies. And what did he do? He didn't sit down and concentrate. I'm going to influence humanity. I'm going to wake up people. It's just the way he held that. And so it's a power being used. So if nothing else, the minimum a successful person with some working of the divine power would use intuition, inspiration, the power of Ishita, to create opportunities and make the opportunities fruitful. And then the power of vyapti, by which the thoughts go darting, flashing through the world, creating waves of tendency. Waves of tendency. It's like a magnetic influence. Things begin to incline and move around him and at a distance. Now, if today we remove television from the picture, remove the internet, that tendency would have still touched that child, although he would not have read it or seen a video of it. As a child, he would suddenly start dreaming, oh, Mars, going to Mars. When I grow up, I will do it. Because this influence is of a goal in 20 years, it aligns with this person's aspiration or evokes his aspiration and slants it as a tendency. And 20 years later, the two connect in some way or other. If the internet and television is there, the person sees and the impact can be that much greater. So near and far. So through television, every far has become somewhat nearer. That's the only difference. We need no more avoid the use of these things than a poet should avoid the use of his poetical genius, which is also a siddhi, unattainable by ordinary men. Or an artist renounce the use of his pencil. So an artist will say, oh, it's a siddhi, it's a gift to be able to have such beautiful paintings or drawings. I should renounce it because siddhis are bad. Anything which exceeds the ordinary in some way would tend towards becoming a siddhi, and you'll say, oh, then I should never exceed the ordinary. That would be the conclusion of wanting to avoid this. But what happens to the idea that, oh, it will misuse, oh, it might exaggerate my ego or lead me away from the divine? Now he will address that. At the same time, there is a justification for the denial of the skeptic and the renunciation by the saint. And of this justification, we must take note. The saint renounces because when these siddhis show themselves fragmentarily in a weak adhara dominated by egoism, adhara is the vehicle, the person, the individual, the container in which the experiences take place. So when these siddhis show themselves fragmentarily, not fully, in a weak adhara vehicle, dominated by egoism, the egoism becomes enormously enhanced. The ignorant sadhaka, practitioner, thinking that he is the possessor and creator of these abnormal powers and a very great man indeed, then the parenthetical comment. Just as we find an abnormal egoism very frequent in the small poet and the half artist. For those who have a really great power, know well enough that the power is not theirs, but a gift from God, and feel that the power of God is using them and not they the power. So here's the thing. If you have a great power, poetry or artist or any of the siddhis, you immediately realize it's not yours. You couldn't have done it even in the best of your capacity. But when you have the power weakly and your egoism is strong, then you say, oh, I'm able to draw so well. See, I am so great. I am drawing well. I am better than you. I am better than them. Oh, I'm so great. But when the power exceeds even what I could imagine, I don't even know how I'm able to do this. It's so exceptional. Then I'm forced to recognize it's not me, it's a gift. So the problem comes when you see, the insight that he gives you is so amazing, so precise and detailed. When the siddhis show themselves fragmentarily in a weak vehicle dominated by egoism. Three things: fragmentary experience, weak vehicle, domination of egoism. Then the tendency is for the egoism to become enhanced, and the fellow thinks that he is possessor and creator of these powers, and so a great person. And he gives the example of poet and half artist, half small poet and half artist. You see, repeatedly he's placing the attainment of the siddhi parallel to great poetry or great art. It's almost like a skill, but now of a different grade order. But all three have an element of the higher range. You cannot be a great poet or a great artist without some intuition. You cannot have the siddhis or their functioning without some opening to the intuitive or some higher grade of consciousness. He continues. So, the sadhaka, practitioner, misled by ahankara, egoism, goes running after these powers for their own sake and leaves following after God. So if you got foolish enough and you said, oh, I am so great, I have this power, you start chasing the power for the sake of the power's enhancement and leaves following after God. But the person who realizes, oh, this is God's gift, what he would say is, the more I align to the divine consciousness, the more the power gets enhanced. His working is enhanced in me. So I would rather grow more towards that, even if it is for my own greatness of the power exercise. The person who says, oh, it's mine, I don't need God anymore. Why do you need God when I can do it better? He is the one who gets misled. So understand the fine nuances, you recognize the tendencies, and you can correct them in you. So now you see the justification of the saint who renounces. The denial of the skeptic is justified by the credulity of ordinary men who regard these things as miracles and invent them where they do not exist, and by the weakness and egoism of the sadhakas themselves and of so many who are not sadhakas, practitioners. For if they catch even a glimpse of these things in themselves or others, they exaggerate, puff, distort, and build around some petty and imperfect experiences all sorts of jargon, mysticism, charlatanism, or bujruki of all kinds, which are an offense and a stumbling block to the world. We must therefore keep in view very strictly certain fixed principles. Okay, so we get an idea here of this word bujruki is from Bengali, which means impostor, cheating, hoax, etc. So here he is explaining what happens which justifies the skeptic. And there are several important ideas here. I want to highlight them because it's very common for us to project onto others powers which they may or may not have, or place somebody on a pedestal based on some perceived power, by which we assume it represents a spiritual development, when it may not. So, the denial of the skeptic is justified by the credulity of ordinary men who regard these things as miracles and invent them where they do not exist. So first we look at this. Because we are credulous, meaning we are willing to believe anything, any junk stated by anybody, we would want to believe because we are desperate enough to latch on to anything. And we consider these to be miracles. So the person must have some miraculous ability. When in fact, he might just be a good businessman with a certain vital power to sense, perceive, manage, manipulate, influence. That's about all. Nothing big, nothing spiritual. Except now, instead of operating in the domain of business, he has shifted to the domain of spirituality for his business. And so that same success he would apply in influencing in the business domain to manufacture or to sell or whatever. He is now manufacturing and selling teachings, programs, or whatever it is the framework is. What would be the difference? Does he even need to have a real spiritual capacity? Probably not. So you're credulous. Oh, but he talks so many nice things. He speaks of God. He reads from the such and such text and comments on them. So he must be spiritual because he also demonstrates some power or some miracle. But the businessman demonstrates the same power, perhaps more effectively, but he's selling you a product. So you say, but that's not spiritual, so he's not. You understand? It's actually equivalent if you look at it that way. So regard these things as miracles is first your error. They're not miracles, they're utilizations of certain powers, even natural powers. And we invent the miracles where they do not exist. So very often you will find this around people who are stated as teachers or heads of lineages or heads of spiritual communities. I remember one person who had gone to a particular famous saint, let's say, who would perform miracles. And she said she was sitting alone, and the saint suddenly looked at her and made a certain gesture. And this girl interpreted it as meaning, "Where is your husband?" He made a gesture like this. So, like this, authority and questioning where. Said, he's asking, "Where's my husband?" And she was not married. Said, "Wow, he read my mind that I'm not married." Or he knew. Now, suppose it was a married person who, and she was obviously sitting without a man next to her. Oh, he's asking, "Where's your husband?" He didn't come. He couldn't come. See, the man read it. Interesting. Your mind, being credulous, will turn the situation to justify your belief that there was a miraculous reading. And the play can be actually quite skillful, the way we choose to deceive ourselves in such things. I've seen this so much in spaces where people want to believe desperately because they want to cling to the idea that the path they're following or the teacher they're following is worth following, for which they've given up so much and they sacrificed so much. So it better be worth it. And so they will start justifying every little detail, every little nuance in a way to convince themselves that this is something extraordinary for which it was worth that. And then, so there's a recognition or regard that these things are miracles, invent them where they do not exist, and then more. And then, and by the weakness and egoism of the sadhakas themselves, and of many who are not sadhakas. So, the sadhaka themselves being weak, you will find that there is this distortion, the credulity which comes from it around themselves, around others, and those who are not sadhakas. For if they catch even a glimpse of these things in themselves or others, they exaggerate. When it happens, the reason I did last time was to give examples which touch all our lives, to show that these are not extraordinary or abnormal, they're already within us as a potential. We saw Sri Aurobindo saying, if you only remove the thing which blocks it from habit, it can start working. It's that close. And I took examples specifically of that grade which we can tap into, which touch us daily. Now, when that thing a little happens and you are in some practice and you say, see, because of my practice now I had this experience, I have grown, I have become so great. So they exaggerate, puff, distort and build around them some petty and imperfect experience. All sorts of jargon, mysticism, etc. So as children, sometimes you might have done this. Most children tend to do it sometime or other. I will strongly that this should happen. And I look, it happened. And then you start building a fantasy around it. Every time I will strongly, it didn't happen. I have to will stronger. Keep trying. Now it happened. See there. Of course, eventually you tire because you realize half the time it's happening, half the time it's not happening. Or maybe a little more than half. But still you realize it's not constant. But during the time when it happened a few times, you actually try to believe, convince yourself, okay, it's an operational power. So, on the other hand, if you start this doubt to come in, it will also prevent the actual thing from functioning. So he's showing you both extremes. But when you do this, when it happens, you start building around it a jargon and mysticism, deceptions of all kind, which are an offense and a stumbling block to the world. It creates deceptions in the world. Let me take another example, very concrete. If some figure, saintly, materializes an object, In your mind, the assumption is that it is a spiritual being, and therefore your access to him will give you spiritual growth. Or if you pray to him or give him something, are seeking help, it will be a spiritual intervention that will take place. Not really, because that thing itself was not a spiritual action in the first beginning, or did not represent an actual spiritual capacity in the person, or even a high grade of consciousness. This can be done by anybody at any level, because it's a vital skill, or sometimes even a physical skill that a physical stage magician could do. If you had a stage magician who's able to make things appear, disappear, and you see some of these quite skillful, except now he modifies it and puts on a certain garb and says, I'm spiritual. You would say, he has a spiritual power because he has magical capacity, means higher consciousness. Not at all. Because even this capacity, if it comes from a link with lower vital beings, it's of a far lower grade of influence. Crude, coarse, ugly, even if you were to sense the being behind. So all these associations which have come in popular thinking, they justify the skepticism of the one who denies these miracles. So even one could say that for you to refuse all miracles and refuse to engage with them or disbelieve them is a kind of a safety measure to not get swayed by deceptive appearances. So this is the background he has given us, justifying the position of both the skeptic as well as the saint who shuns. But in the context which he has given us, where all this is part of the fulfillment of the divine potential. So we must therefore keep in view very strictly certain fixed principles. 1. That these powers are not miraculous but powers of nature, capital N, which manifest of themselves as soon as the Vijnana Padma in us begins to open. Vijnana Padma is the lotus of the higher cognition. Let's use the term higher cognition. A higher grade of consciousness above the intellect. When the lotus of that begins to open, immediately these powers manifest. No big deal. They are powers of nature, not miraculous. And are no more a case for bragging and vanity than the power of eating and breathing or anything else that is nature's. Interesting. He's reducing it to an equivalent grade of eating and breathing, except eating and breathing is function of biology. This is function of this particular grade. But still in the domain of nature, does not require self, does not require spiritual, and certainly is not a miracle. So first correction. Second, that they can manifest fully. So remember, he's speaking of their partial operation as soon as this particular center begins to open. Second, that they can manifest fully only when we leave ego and offer up our petty separate being in the vastness of God's being. In other words, this partial operation, which is functioning in normal nature, will always be partial, will always be defective, will always be even deceptive because it's mixed. You want it to be fully operational and perfectly operational, then you have to give up your sense of separateness in the vastness of God consciousness, leaving aside ego. Now remember, he's not saying anything about you must grow in consciousness. He's only saying you must become vast in God's being. Your narrow ego sense you have to give up. See, the condition is very important. It's not about egoism, I will misuse. Yes, that also is there. But the full operation is not there because, I will misuse or not. It has nothing to do with that. It's not a moral or ethical thing. It's about your narrow consciousness limiting its full operation. When your consciousness widens, then the full operation becomes possible, and it's still nature's operation. But when you widen, you can become quite wide, even vitally wide, mentally wide. But the only real wideness is when you open to an infinite wideness, which is the vastness of God's being. There is no other wideness. Anything else would be finite, but big finite. So even here, it's not a spiritual thing he's talking about. It's about this widening, the vastness of God's being. Why is this important? We'll look at this operation, let's say Vyapti, for example, where you experience influences of others, their states, etc., impacting you without you meaning or trying even. Or Prakamya, where you try. Just look at Vyapti first. If your consciousness is small, you meet somebody with a strong vital, you will feel the pressure of their vital on you. If they're strong enough, they will dominate you in a way that they will get you to say yes even when you came to say no. And you will like it, you will want it. That's the skill. You're turned in such a way, you'll say, oh, thank God I said yes. I had thought to come and say no. That's when it was successful. It changed your state, even overcame your resistance of wanting to say no. You're small, you experience this, that's all. If you're small enough and got overwhelmed, you don't even realize you were a puppet. If you are partially overwhelmed, you say, hey, how did that happen? I still want to say no, but I can't. What is this magic of influence? You're aware of it. When your consciousness becomes a little larger, you notice that it's not just with somebody with an overwhelming force, even with others who are sitting daydreaming, because your consciousness is larger and you experience them as if inside you, you feel what they're feeling. Oh, this person seems to be in deep distress. And you say you are empathic. I feel what you're feeling. If your boundary is not formed, is not strong, is not able to reject all these influences, you find yourself getting overwhelmed by everything that comes your way. So when I sit and the person is in suffering, sad, I feel overwhelmed by their sadness and I feel sad. Now, if at that point you're not conscious, you don't know why. You went to a space, maybe you were in a library or you were in a public transport. The person next to you had a severe depression. You come away from having sat there for half an hour and you came away and you found yourself depressed. I don't know what happened. This morning I was so bright. By the time I've reached the office, I'm severely depressed. And I'm not conscious that I caught the infection of depression while traveling in the bus or train. But when you grow a little bit conscious, then you notice, oh, it is this person and I'm feeling the influence affecting me, entering me. When your consciousness now becomes even wider, the interesting thing is, you remember somebody and you feel. Somebody feels you strongly or thinks of you strongly and you remember them, not knowing that it was triggered by them remembering. When you become even wider, you feel the condition of the mass in the larger collective. You find yourself exposed, or maybe you develop the capacity to insulate partially, but the moment you choose to feel widely, you sense immediately. And then you say, I'd rather be in the forest where it is so much nicer than in the city where it is oppressive almost. But if at this point there's a deeper spiritual dimension, let's say something of the deeper influence, I will say, even a distant influence of the self is felt, you feel a great, vast peace. You feel this wonderful depth, even a solidity of freedom. And then in that you realize, oh, there are all these things happening. You have automatically the freedom with the sensitivity. The ability to be unoverwhelmed without losing the perception itself. So in gradations of our growth, you find the key. And especially if it acquires increasingly vastness of God's being, influence of the self filling in the vastness, not merely just an extension of consciousness, then all this becomes natural. The ego sense automatically thins. And then what happens? As you're in that state, what the person perceives, and you perhaps turn to interact with somebody, and you feel already their internal state. When you feel their internal state, you feel not only they are within you, you are within them, but because you are within them, when you feel that wave of compassion, or you want as if to lift them from that, the intention and the shift in your consciousness is enough to actually lift them from that state. That's the prakamya. You have intervened. You felt them, you reached out as if, oh, I wish. As if in a physical hand, you would reach out to a child who's weeping and caress and say, "Don't worry, my child." And in your consciousness, you're doing exactly that, except you don't need the physical hand for that. It can be even at a certain distance, but it's an embrace in which your consciousness lifts. "Don't worry, my child," and it goes. Interesting. It's natural to that state of widened consciousness, especially in the vastness of God's being. Your narrow person automatically thins because now you feel everybody's thing as yours or as if somewhere within you. Your own suffering, you realize, is just part of a larger universal working, and you don't give to it such a great importance. All right, we'll deal with it. So, at this point, the functioning of these powers is smooth, natural, and more complete in proportion as you are more and more in this consciousness. So, you understand the rationale. It's not a moralistic or ethical requirement. It's not as if, oh, first purify yourself, remove your desire, then you can properly use. That's a way of looking at it, but indirectly and by secondary symptoms. If you look at the underlying principle which Sri Aurobindo shows you, it has nothing to do with morality. It's not about petty egoism getting inflated from a moral point of view. It's about losing the narrowness to recover the vastness of God's being, and the full functioning will happen smoothly now without distortion. So I read the second point, second principle, that they can manifest fully and when we leave ego and offer up our petty separate being in the vastness of God's being. So offer up. This is now the effective word. How do you open to this vastness of God's separate being? The method of the Asura is, I make myself larger and dominate more and wider and impose more and more. You can see how that's bound to fail. Recognize rather that within you, above you, in the divine consciousness of self, already that vastness of your consciousness exists. You, the smallness, what can you do? I will become like that and seize it? No, that doesn't work. Rather, you relax and open to it, invite it, let it fill you and give yourself to it. It draws you into itself, into its vastness, and you merge with it. That's the fastest, most rapid way to attain to that state. And the narrow ego thins out, petty separate being dissolves, thins out, let's say, in the vastness of this larger God's being. And automatically the powers can manifest fully. So, first principle, they are not miraculous powers, they are nature's powers. They begin to act the moment a particular grade of consciousness begins to operate, but they'll be fragmentary, they will be distorted, and they could lead to confusion if you do not understand what they are. Second, when you leave the narrow ego and open and give yourself to the larger vastness of God's being, then they operate, manifest fully, automatically, inevitably. Third principle, that when they manifest in the unpurified state, they are a dangerous ordeal to which God subjects us, and we can only pass through it safely by keeping our minds clear of vanity, pride, selfishness, and by remembering continually that they are His gifts and not our acquirements. So now this is where something happens which is in that domain of recognizing, not seizing upon. So why would he put this third point if already in the second point we have opened, leave behind ego and offer your petty separate being to the vastness of God's being? Because when you do that and you enter that wider state, your ego has not gone away. It is still there. It is just thinned out. But when the experience acts, that thinned out ego can quickly pop up and seize upon the experience. So when they manifest in the unpurified state, you have not yet reached the full thinning of the ego. Your ego is halfway through the thinning process, and the experiences are now growing. Then you say, God is subjecting you a test. It's a dangerous ordeal. You better be careful, don't get distracted. You wait for the thinning of the ego to be more complete, and you observe the tendency for the half-thinned ego to pop up and say, this is mine, and vanity, pride, selfishness, etc. Remembering continually that they are his gifts and not our acquirements. In some earlier discussion, now going back nearly a year, I had shared a personal experience. I do not remember in which episode it was, where I described how there were certain experiences I had received from my teacher, simply imprinted by my teacher, MP Pandit. And during the time when I was just so open, I had many interesting and wonderful experiences, which really shaped and defined the direction of the spiritual journey. But I had never experienced what it was to not have them in a way that is lost. And this is a period of time I was young, I was growing up. So, growing up with certain experiences, you tend to think, well, this is me, this is mine. And even that, there's no way it can be lost because you never experienced what it was to not have it. It's like somebody who grows up in extreme comfort and has not been exposed to what it's like to be uncomfortable will say, well, everybody in the world probably lives like this. So I had this certain experiences. And then at some point, now looking back, I can see there was a part which had seized upon them and said, this is it. You didn't have to think, oh, I'm great. No, it was simply, that's how it is. I have it. No problem. It's mine. And it's used. And then came a very painful passage, which I have described in one of these discussions, where literally everything was taken out. I was left this empty shell. And when it was required, it was all poured back and then taken out immediately after, and again and again and again, and literally being beaten until every part, every layer, down to even the physical body, said, I'm useless, worthless, life is meaningless without this. To that extent, it had to be driven. And then eventually the things were allowed to come. I don't want to go too much into detail, but I just want to highlight this point that it was only after that breaking experience that I could look back and realize the way I had been deceiving myself, or the way, it's not even fair to say deceiving it. When you grew up with that, and so you didn't know better. And until it was broken and taken away and then given back when needed and taken away when not needed repeatedly, again and again, for nearly 2 years. That's when the whole personality down to the physical body understood it's not mine, it is hers. And that needed to be hammered in until it was no more possible to make that mistake. It was only completed when that work was done. Looking back, the intensity of that was so painful. It was, I would not wish it on the worst enemy. But without having gone through it, I would not have understood what it was like and what it really represented. So I just share this as an example to show you that when there is any experience, and it need not be a spiritual experience, any experience of something a little exceptional, it can happen to an artist or a poet equally, in an unpurified state, when some part of the consciousness seizes upon it and says, it's mine. And without necessarily bragging about it, but still that thing which comes with it is enough to be able to bind you and limit you, prevent you from going further, or end up somehow misusing it. And what is required is remembering continually that they are his gifts and not our acquirements. I'm going to extend it a further step or two. If you have a healthy body, if you have a strong vitality, if you have a certain developed capacity of intelligence or imagination or any other skill that you have, it's easy to say, oh, I'm more intelligent, I'm more strong, I'm more healthy. It's in the same grade. It's not different. Except for these things, there's not too much spiritual consequence, but for those things it can, because it's already allows you to operate in a domain which is not common to others and interferes with your spiritual progress. So as a rule, as a principle, what I would say is everything you have, which is good, including your aspiration, even your aspiration to want to grow Godward. Did you create it? Did you sit down one day and say, I'm going to create an aspiration for this? It was there. You grew up with it. Don't make the mistake of thinking it is your aspiration. Even the aspiration is given to you. You have a healthy body given to you. You have a strong willpower, creative imagination, whatever it is. You have been fortunate in certain ways, in opportunities given to you. All was given to you by the Divine Mother. And be grateful to her for that and turn the gifts, turn the basic comforts of life even towards her, saying, this is yours. Never take the position that I own, I am, I have. It may be true that, but it was given to you, therefore you own, you have, etc. It could also be taken away. Hopefully, one doesn't need to pass through the experience of the thing being taken away to realize that. And that is what we would want to avoid. And logically, you think about it, introspect. You didn't create it. You didn't even know what to do. If it was taken away, you wouldn't know how to recreate it. So it's not yours. It's hers. It's a gift. So the third requirement, the third principle is that when you have this and it's starting to operate, or any special feature, capacity that you have being operating in your consciousness, it's a dangerous ordeal to which God subjects us, and we can only pass through it safely by keeping our minds clear of vanity, pride, selfishness, and remembering continually that they are His gifts and not our requirements. Fourth, I'm going to give another example of this. There was an incident of a person in the ashram. He had a tremendous vitality. He was one of those types who was a titan. One of those that the mother had brought to work for building her work. And he was in the building service of the ashram. And there's an incident which was narrated by my teacher, MP Pandit, where I don't know how, maybe he saw it or he had heard of it from one of mother's attendants, where the mother told this man that all the vital power that you have is given to you by me. And if you do not do whatever it was, the right thing, I will take it away from you. It's very rare that she would speak like that, and only to that particular type, the Titan type. And what my teacher said was, in later part of life, he had actually acquired that, he had gone into that experience where everything was removed, and he would experience very intensely that loss. So these are exceptional situations they had because they're very powerful vitally, but the principle is applicable everywhere for all of us. Fourth principle, Sri Aurobindo says, that these powers are not to be pursued for their own sake, but developed or allowed to develop as part of the flower of divine perfection, which is by God's grace blossoming out in us. So you could say, as you are doing for certain martial arts, I'm going to build this skill, I'm going to build this muscle, I'm going to build that technique. It's possible to do that. And you can do that, as long as you treat that as a flowering out of a divine perfection in you and not the thing for itself. So the natural tendency you would have, and as children, all of us have at some point dreamt it or seen it in movies or in novels. This child has this ability. Oh, I wish I could do that. So in one of these, typically these novels, oh, this man could read minds and could do so many things. I wish I had that. I wish I could develop this. And you see the thinking, it is about, by developing this, I'll be able to do whatever I want. The basic objective is to satisfy my comfort, desire, need to navigate my life. It's not seen as a flowering out of the divine perfection in you. If, on the other hand, you see that in this functioning of the divine perfection in you, and this has to be your first base, a certain grade of consciousness is developing, with it certain capacities are developing, and I can fine-tune this capacity. Let's take a more general example rather than the Siddhi, just the intuitive perception. You have spontaneously certain intuition. Oh, this is likely to happen. Observe. Make your mind very quiet. Observe, did it actually happen the way I perceived it? Okay, it was slightly off. What was the part in me that went off? Oh, there was such and such an expectation which distorted slightly the intuition. And I correct that to remove that expectation, quiet my mind, bring a deeper equality, and wait for the functioning of this faculty. And this is acceptable. This is not wrong. This is part of the spiritual development and the training. So, that these powers are not to be pursued for their own sake, but they're meant to be developed. So, but developed and allowed to develop. So, you may develop them actively, or you may allow them to develop by the working of the force in you and say, okay, it's happening. I just watch and allow her to purify it. Or you may actively intervene and say, yes, I must consciously purify it. Both are acceptable. As part of the flower of divine perfection, which is by God's grace blossoming out in us. So the whole movement is blossoming by God's grace, and as part of that, I'm working to make this more perfect, not chasing it for its own sake. You see the difference? It's a huge difference. And then he says, subject to these cautions, we have not to reject these powers when they come, but accept them. So when they come, it's not that you say, okay, now I think I'm going to have to start to develop the power of telepathy. It's going to be useful for my business. You can. It'll have a different role. It will not be as part of your sadhana. But if as part of your sadhana, you're working to open your consciousness, as part of the widening of consciousness, some of these perceptions naturally are developing. You don't reject. You accept when they come. To be used in us by God for His purposes and not by us for ours. To be poured out by Vyapti on humanity. That's that power of the influence which happens naturally. And not kept for our use, for our own use and pride. So much of this can be easily avoided if from the beginning your basic relationship in the yoga is one of recognizing that the work being done and the results are the consequence of the Divine Mother's working. And if your primary objective is constantly to become more immersed in the joy of her presence and in the active increase of her working in you, if you keep that as your priority, as your measure of the sadhana, then even as these things develop, you notice them, oh yeah, it's happening, it's interesting. You observe, and if needed, you make the corrections to make them more perfect, but you're not sidelined by an exaggerated view of these things. You continue doing the thing which has led to these openings. So it's a short article, but it gives you a very clear perspective. And the four things you can see, we can quickly recapitulate. First, they are not miraculous. They are powers of nature. Natural the moment a certain part in you begins to operate, but they'll always be mixed initially. They cannot, so point two, they cannot become fully manifest as long as you're in a narrow ego. You have to leave that and offer yourself, your petty separateness, to the vastness of the divine consciousness, to God's being. Third, that when you're still in the unpurified state and they begin to manifest, you treat it as a dangerous, risky passage. And you make a conscious effort to remind yourself constantly that this is the divine working, they are God's gifts and not your achievements, and not get swayed by idea of vanity and pride. And fourth, that you do not pursue them for themselves, and you allow them to develop or actively develop them as part of the larger working of the divine perfection. Now, all of these would be relatively easy to do if the first basis of the integral yoga was already worked upon, which is a basic purification and alignment around your central aspiration. And then the 6 limbs of the integral yoga would be even faster, more natural, more rapidly developed once that base is sufficiently stable. So if you follow the natural sequence of the yoga, then much of this is avoided. And remember, before you come to this third limb of the yoga, they are the first two. which would have already prepared you by a deep equality and deep peace, etc., and the relationship with the divine Shakti and the opening and giving yourself to the divine mother, they would have prepared you for this outcome. If you had done the first two, they would lead naturally to this outcome. So that's why there's a natural sequence in the structure of the yoga. But because we are all different, in some of us, operations in the third limb might go faster than the operations of the first and second, in which case you would have these principles to strictly follow so that you don't get waylaid or distracted. Very simple, isn't it? I'll quickly look at the chat box. So there are interesting experiences people have shared. So Aspirer is asking, is there any Siddhi that helps in realizing the psychic being? Realizing the psychic being itself would be a perfection, isn't it? So you could call that the Siddhi. But yes, if you look at the question from a different point of view, is there any faculty, power, process, effort which would help to realize the psychic being? Then the answer to that would be very simple. Become conscious of your deepest aspiration that turns Godward. Become conscious of that part in you where you feel yourself close to the Divine Mother and a child of the Divine Mother. This feeling, this sentiment, this sense of closeness, this sense of familiarity with the Divine Mother or with the Divine Consciousness is natural to the psychic presence and felt in you as a reflection or influence of the psychic being within you. So the part in you which feels this is presently the closest part in you that knows the psychic being or through which you can know the psychic being. So if you consciously, actively develop this sense of closeness with the mother, with the divine consciousness, generally in whatever way you feel, and the gratitude that comes from there, and the sense of self-giving, the sense of closeness, the sense of belonging, cultivate these. Automatically in that, with that, the psychic influence will begin to come forward and grow in intensity. And at some point when that influence is strong enough, you'll find yourself drawn into it and drawn towards its own source. And the contact will become more and more direct. Second, as this grows, organize more and more your life priorities around this immersion, this sense of closeness with the divine, around this aspiration that you feel. What does that mean? Your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, the decisions you take with your life, let them all be aligned that they support this or allow this to grow. Notice certain things you do as if cover this or make this contact seem to go far. Avoid those. Increase those which give you the contact, etc. So, first developing the contact, and second, aligning things around you more and more to nourish this and avoid things which distract. That would be your way to the psychic experience more and more. Revati says, wonder what the divine in his supreme wisdom would think of us ignorant humans when our acts are so stupid. Yes, he is all forgiving and so full of love and compassion. Oh, beautiful Sri Aurobindo. It's not even forgiving. You see, this idea of forgiveness is still a human construction. The reality is, when you see a dog, for example, being somehow stubborn in its tendency, you understand, oh, poor fellow, he's stuck in his nature. You have a compassion. Yes, a compassion is there, but there's nothing to forgive. There's an aphorism of Sri Aurobindo which goes something like this. When God slapped me, do I have to turn to God and say, oh, I forgive you your insolence? Interesting. This idea of forgiveness belongs to a very narrow band of human consciousness. It's not natural to the higher consciousness, which actually looks at you in compassion and says, oh, I wish you can get free of this very quickly. And whatever the stupidity, but the questions relating to current affairs will keep for much later once we pass through. Yes, so Anupam says there's a good movie named Dosti, produced by Tarachand Barjatia, released in 1964, dedicated to the mother. In fact, I remember as a child, all the movies that came into the late early 80s, maybe even late 80s, all of them, at least when they were shown in the ashram playground, they started with a photograph of the mother and a dedication to her. So I don't know if they were there in all the copies distributed all over India, but he would put this quite prominently. So Revati says, at one point of time, I was creating some inspiring music. I knew that I had no role in creating it. The ideas were flowing from somewhere else, literally like a light bulb. I didn't know how to consciously connect though. Yes, that's a good example. When things happen which are already quite exceptional and they already rise above, then it's easy to recognize that it's not yours. But if from childhood you grew up being able to write remarkably well, you'd say, I am gifted in language or whatever it is. You say, I am special. I have come first. I did. I achieved. And all through your childhood, people have said, oh, you came first. You're so great. You're so good. You're better than all those others. That's the programming. Nobody tells you, hey, you have been gifted by the Divine Mother. This is the Divine Mother's gift. I'm not sure the child would fully understand that, but at least an initial orientation that makes you recognize that all this is, all our skills are especially a gift from the divine, that might help to not get into that error. Mahesh says, asking comes so naturally, but thanking almost never comes. We remember God passionately in need, but don't remember to have gratitude when what we ask for is given. Yes, this is one of the reasons why we tend to not have the full benefit of the help. When we are desperate, we open to help. The help comes. From the point the help starts acting and our desperation passes, we begin to close and stop the help from fully completing even what was begun. We come back to our normal and say, I am normal. But if I had kept that state of opening, the help would have not only pulled you out of that difficulty, but taken you far more into other things. But by habit, you've already closed it. And that's why in the context of the integral yoga, especially, this movement of opening and self-giving, once you develop this for the relationship with the divine and integrate this into activities of life, a very large number of spiritual experiences begin to open up simply by this fact of being open and receptive. Quite a large part of even the structure of the integral yoga, the things Sri Aurobindo describes, they all begin to happen first quite naturally, spontaneously. You hardly notice that it's happening. And then at one point you look back and say, oh yeah, last year I didn't have these. It's been happening, but it's quite consistent and it stays as long as you open. And at some point as you begin to close, you see that all those things also tended to subside or fade out. And that's why we make a distinction between the religious seeker who calls when in need of help and closes when no more needed, and the actual practice of sadhana where it is not just calling for help, but an active state of being in which we learn to live, which allows them so much more to happen. Zen Rain is asking, is it correct to say descent of peace as a base would be the foundation for the development? Yes, in the structure of the integral yoga, remember, the first chatushtaya, the first limb, is one of equality and peace foundation. So if that has been built, followed by amplification of the working of the Shakti in you and you opening to the Shakti and feeling yourself a child of the Divine Mother, then this third phase becomes relatively natural and also safe. You're unlikely to have those kinds of distortions. But still, he has explained to you what are the things to watch out for. And if you keep just that as a basic reference, on the basis of the first two limbs, the third limb becomes very smooth. You see, the structure of the integral yoga itself is so well made, so smoothly structured that most of the dangers are avoided if you simply follow the natural unfoldment. So with the descent of peace, also there will be a vast equality. Let that stabilize. And with the base of the peace itself, into that the presence of the Divine Mother grows, builds, and the descent of the Shakti filling it, all these would be natural further steps. Aditya says, this calling for help in the time of need and desperation has created a bad mental habit in me, because now I think somewhere in my mind I have a negative association with prayer. True enough. We pray only when we have a problem, isn't it? And so that association can easily form. Make the shift. Don't think of it as prayer anymore. Think of it as enjoying the closeness with the divine presence, with the divine mother, in whatever way you feel the most natural relationship. Let it be one of enjoying that intimacy and the joy that you feel when you feel that closeness. Even the idea of prayer, give me this, do that, solve this problem, let that go away. Let me feel close and the joy of that closeness. Feel that, enjoy that, and let that become your primary drive. Then all these problems will be avoided. I will take up a few questions which were there in the emails which we received as well as comments from last time. Dorian is asking, Sri Aurobindo had mentioned the use of the technique of Tratak, concentration on a candle flame, in order to develop concentration and occult vision. Can you please expand on how to do this exercise? On the other, I understand that Siddhis naturally unveil themselves as our spiritual consciousness grows. Then what would you say then would you say it is a sort of waste of time to do exercises to develop those abilities? Thank you for your reply. If you're okay. So both very good questions. First, how would you practice if you wanted to do this concentration? I could not find the passage where Sri Aurobindo recommends the use. Maybe he mentions it in passing. I did find a passage where the mother speaks of that also. But again, it's not really put as a recommendation. It's more like reference. So in the passage of the mother, which is quite unusual, and I had not seen this before, regarding this Tratak is a term used in the yoga tradition for a concentration where you hold your physical gaze and mind's awareness on a single point in a sustained way, intended to develop the power of concentration and by extension also the inner perception. So I found this passage, a letter of the mother to somebody about the practice. And she writes, this symbol of Sri Aurobindo must be thickly drawn in chalk on the blackboard so that it can be seen clearly from a distance. The eyes must be fixed on it constantly without looking at anything else. It is by this steady concentration of the eyes physically that one gets absorbed in what one stares at and identifies with it, and the mind gets silent. So she has written this as a guideline to somebody who asked how I can do this. It's not a guideline where she says everybody should do this. So don't make the mistake, oh, mother has said it, so we all should do it. It's not a fundamental practice. It's not a basic practice required. But if someone wanted to do, as Dorian is asking, we can say, well, here's one way you could do, which should be in the symbol as the person asked. That's not the way normally done. But if you want to do it that way, you could. But I'll get to the fundamentals at a very essential level. Okay, I'm going to read from Sri Aurobindo. He has an answer there in passing in one of the letters when somebody asks about concentration. So he explains that normally the consciousness is all dispersed and you bring back the dispersed concentration to concentrate. The place where you concentrate normally is somewhere normally in the head region, typically, if it is a thought, or in the heart if it is a feeling on which you concentrate. So this is the general focus of what concentration does in life. Then he says, the yogic concentration is simply an extension and intensification of the same thing. So in principle, you're doing the same thing, but amplified. It may be on an object as one does Tratak on a shining point. Then one has to concentrate so that one sees only that point and has no other thought but that. It may be on an idea or a word or a name, the idea of the divine, the word Om, the name Krishna, or a combination of idea and word or idea and name. So he's not saying do this. He's saying any of these could be a point of concentration in the yoga practice, if you choose to do that. But farther, in yoga, one also concentrates in a particular place. There is the famous rule of concentrating between the eyebrows, the center of the inner mind of occult vision, of the will is there. What you do is to think firmly from there on whatever you make the object of your concentration. or else try to see the image of it from there. If you succeed in this, then after a time, you feel that your whole consciousness is centered there in that place. Of course, for the time being. After doing it for some time and often, it becomes easy and normal. Now, all this again, he is describing general yoga practice, not even integral yoga. Then he continues in the letter. I hope this is clear. Well, in this yoga, now he's coming to the integral. In this yoga, you do the same, not necessarily at that spot between the eyebrows, but anywhere in the head or at the center of the chest, where the physiologists have fixed the cardiac center. Instead of concentrating on an object, you concentrate in the head in a will, a call for the descent of the peace from above, or, as some do, an opening of the unseen lid and an ascent of the consciousness above. In the heart center, one concentrates in an aspiration for an opening, for the presence or living image of the divine there, or whatever else is the object. There may be japa of a name, but if so, there must also be a concentration on it, on the name, and the name must repeat itself there in the heart center. So, he spoke of what is concentration generally, what is concentration in the yogic consciousness, in the yogic context, and there Trataka is mentioned in passing. But coming to the integral yoga, none of these are required. Concentration is required. So if it is in the head, from here you open to the above and ask for the descent or the ascent. If it is the heart, you open to the presence of the divine within you. If you make this the priority, concentration is a critical means for the integral yoga. For this purpose, you may or not choose to build the power of concentration itself. This you can do in the midst of a specific activity that you do just by amplifying focus there. Or you may, as Dorian asks, use an exercise for building concentration, and Tratak could be one such. So I'm putting it in the right context. Now, if one such Tratak you wish to do, then you see what Sri Aurobindo has said about that. You take a point normally, typically, shining point, because it's easier to hold attention. And one has to concentrate so that one sees only that point and has no other thought but that. So the key here, if you want to do the practice of Tratak of any kind, and I'll describe in more detail one form you could do it. You draw a spot on the wall. So typically we have white walls. You draw a spot with a pencil. Sit at a certain distance that is comfortable, that your physical eyes don't strain. So it's not too far nor too near, comfortable for you. No other distraction. Blank wall means you have no other images. Place your attention with your physical sight. You see nothing else except that point. With your mind, you think nothing else except that point. This is critical. And then you hold and hold and hold and hold as long as you can. There's a point after which you'll notice first your mind getting distracted. And with that, the physical sight might get distracted. If you can hold the physical sight, then the mind becomes the challenge. Once you get the mind in, the physical is easy. Once you can hold the mind, you see how long you can hold. Since the goal is to practice Tratak here only to build concentration, like muscles, you keep doing with full attention the muscular exercise. So you keep doing holding the mind with full attention as long as you can. So it's a simple exercise. You push the boundary, push the limits, and when it finishes, you'll find you're in a state of one-pointedness, and that capacity to be one-pointed can be directed to any activity you do. Your power of concentration will grow. I'm going to push it a little further because you can bring it to a deeper dimension. As you hold this point, your mind is on it. After a while, you will notice you see the point, but everything else becomes blurred. No strain on the physical sight. Everything else becomes blurred, only the point is seen. Continue. After a while, it will feel as if there's a tunnel-like connection between your awareness and that point. Continue. After a point, it will be as if there is no tunnel, there is nothing except point, and you are one with point. Bring it to that stage. That's your key. To be able to push your power of concentration to the point where there's nothing else except that, there is only that. There's nothing else existing even, and you're one with that as if. Push to that limit. You forget yourself. You cease to exist. Only point remains. When you can bring concentration to this point, that same power of concentration can be turned to anything else, and you will acquire that experience of identity with what you seek. So concentration itself is a critical capacity in the yoga, and in the integral yoga. Do watch the talk where we have discussed the direct method, where concentration and faith, the two combine to lead you into any experience. And so if your power is sufficiently developed for this, you can make it a very powerful means to rapidly grow in stages of consciousness and inner experience. So if you're centered in the head and turn up invoking the peace, in that one-pointed concentration, you experience the peace above, you invoke it, you experience it settling within you, then you identify fully with the dense presence of the peace until you cease to exist and there is only that peace. And at that point, you're touching literally as if the foundation of the peace in the self. You go within in the same way with that one-pointedness, you feel the divine presence, and you touch and join and merge with whatever it is you've been concentrating on. And that becomes the entry point to go all the way into the psychic and even identify with the psychic presence, etc. So I'm putting Dorian's question purely in this context for use of developing the power of concentration. On the other hand, without doing any exercise of concentration of this kind, just by holding the concentration on the piece and making that your one-pointedness without external point on the wall, you make the piece itself the focus, you attain to the same thing. But if you have done that, it may be a help for this, but you can make this itself the direct process. You don't need to do any external exercise, but you hold the piece with the same one-pointedness. So I'll simply put it this way. If you're able to hold, then don't even waste time on an external image on the wall or a point on the wall. Hold on the experience itself. If you're finding it difficult to hold there, use this practice for a few days and you won't need more. If you've built this for a few days and it's strong enough, switch as quickly as possible straight to the experience. You will not waste more time. Build the concentration itself now in the experience. And that will be a shorter way to the further development. So your second half of the question is important. Why would you waste time to do exercises if anyway the Siddhis naturally unveil themselves as the spiritual consciousness grows? In order to perfect your concentration, in order to perfect your immersion in the experience. For that purpose, certain exercises would be useful. Perfecting may also involve purifying, etc. But certain exercises might assist in your ability to do that. So I would not start with technical methods to get the experience. That's not worthwhile. Get the experience directly, and then you may do exercises which assist in amplifying or deepening for that purpose. And as quickly as possible, the exercise itself is one with the experience, then the question itself becomes irrelevant. That's the way I would suggest normally. There's a allied question which Champaklal had asked Sri Aurobindo. Well, anyway, when the peace descends, I will experience it. So why should I sit for meditation? When it comes, it will come. So Sri Aurobindo's observation was, if you're not used to being in that state of quiet receptivity, when it comes, you won't be able to hold it. So certain practices you will do to prepare your capacity to open and to receive. So when it descends, you can hold what comes receiving. But if you start with that, you open and receive, and the peace comes, you hold and receive. That from the beginning, you have an experience, and you build on deepening the experience, even as you sit to practice. So my suggestion is to let the two things merge. Salil has 3 questions. In the talk of the EWS, I think maybe 95, 96 or something in that range, titled The First Business of a Sadhaka, Sri Aurobindo asks us to exercise steadily his will on his nature and invite the will of the Purusha to grow towards perfect equality. So he says the first clause sounds very much like Vashita, where one part of us needs to orient other parts of us in a certain direction. The second clause seems to point to Aishwarya, where we open to the mother and ask her direct help. Can you please clarify? Yes, you can look at it like this. It is. I did not think of it in that way, but in a sense, there are parts within us which are exercising their will on other parts in us. So, to that extent, these powers of the siddhis are being used internally within us. Normally, all the siddhis we think in terms of us influencing people or things outside us. But the point he's making is we're also doing it internally to us. And yes, of course. But how does it help to think of it in that way? Then would you say you have to increase the power of Vashita to be able to direct your thoughts? It doesn't help to think like that. So I would simply say look at it rather as you becoming conscious and gathering and directing your thoughts or your intentions or amplifying your aspiration. Yes, these are faculties. That's why Sri Aurobindo said they're natural working of nature. The analysis of how you do, why you do, or what is working is often irrelevant in such a case. When the divine Shakti works in you, similarly, you can say, oh, is she operating by Ishita or Aishwarya or Vashita? It doesn't matter. You open yourself and let her act. So the technical analysis is only relevant when it's going out from you to something else, and you notice these distinctions. In practice, even these powers would tend to blend increasingly, each supporting the other, and their working also blends until it becomes a spontaneous, multifaceted working. The second question, in 2016, I was watching a video of your USA retreats. From deep within me, a voice said, I want to attend such a retreat. After a few days or weeks, you called me with a warm invitation. Is this how true need and Ishita work? Later on, I heard a similar incident in Kirit Joshi's life. He said in an interview that he worked in the library, and one day the inner voice said, I want to teach. And the next day, the mother sent someone to ask him if he would teach in the ashram school. Yes, you can say it could be like that. It could be an alignment of the inner aspiration and circumstances which come your way. In the yoga, particularly, and when there is the action of the mother's force, an inner aspiration aligns with an external help, it's very difficult to distinguish which happened first, especially when it relates to the mother's consciousness. Because on some level, I will put it this way, she awakes the aspiration in us to which she responds. If you think of it in this way, the whole picture changes, isn't it? The separation between I wanting, needing, aspiring, and her response coming, that thing itself fades out. It is she working within me who awakes and amplifies the aspiration, and in response comes and fills and acts. This is a superior poise to hold, in which there is no cause effect. It is all her working. And of course, at that point, you can participate to amplify what she is doing in you. She awakens the aspiration, and you choose to give it importance. You choose to immerse in it. You choose to participate more fully in it. But she started. She lit the fire into which you put more and more of yourself to align and complete the aspiration. So there your participation becomes relevant. The third question is the incident of Vasishta Ganapati Muni transmuting a coin into gold. Would it be a voluntary and conscious use of Anima Siddhi? Yes, this is one example of how you can transmute a substance. Last time I had given examples of Sri Aurobindo also utilizing the Siddhi of Laghima, and when he held his arms and legs up, and even that it leads to uthapana, levitation, etc. I had given a few examples, and I missed one example which was very important, and I've shared before, but in this context I will repeat. So it's very important because we have only one source of a person who has seen this. This we found in an interview. I believe it was 1990 that we had done the interview with somebody who used to be mother's driver. His name was Bala. And he was a child when he saw Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and his mother or grandmother was the maid in the ashram and in Sri Aurobindo's room. So at a stage when the ashram had not yet formally formed, she was the maid there. And so she had the privilege of sweeping Sri Aurobindo's room. And he remembers as a child hearing from her that she was very scared of Sri Aurobindo. She kept saying he's a great magician. Why? And then she narrated to this child, who later became mother's driver. She narrated to him incidents, she said, where as she's sweeping, she sees Sri Aurobindo sitting on the chair with one arm raised, and then two arms raised, and then sometimes with a leg and arm raised. So what we see in the record of yoga that he is documenting, that he can keep his arm up for hours together with no fatigue. And then she has documented, occasionally, she is sweeping, she turns around, and he is not in his chair. He has vanished. And she's scared. She turns away and continues sweeping. And then she looks again and he's back. That description is only from that one case, Bala's whatever, grandmother or mother, I don't remember now. And we have recorded this, we have put it on tape. And it's one of those things which I'm so glad we managed to get in time. So it's the only example we have of this. So actually he was able to take this particular power of the Anima Siddhi. You remember the text we read last time where he explains how, taken to its full, it can make even objects invisible. So operating on his full body consciousness, not only the ability to hold without strain effectively aim in the direction of even levitation, but also invisibility, pushed to that point where the entire body seems to have become invisible for that period. And she was there, she had seen some of this. Of course, once he had developed that and the faculty itself was sufficiently stable, he would not need to work on it. So we don't know anybody else who has seen this. Not even one of his personal attendants, at least nobody has ever told us of having seen this. And two more quick questions, we will end with this. Anupam, even singing particular ragas can change the course of nature if properly done. There are musicians like Baiju Bavra or Tansen who could cause rain to happen or lamps to light from the raga. Is that related with Siddhi? Yes, it is. And it is really a faculty where the music and the concentration in the music is directed towards a particular outcome. So there are certain ragas of rain. You can sing them. Maybe you'll feel cool. I don't know. But you can direct them specifically to trigger rain in the air, in that space, in that region. And that's when the Siddhi is operative. And this music itself becomes a vehicle for focusing the power and engaging with the process that triggers the rain, or the beings which trigger the rain. It may function within the framework of the belief system of the musician that, oh, this raga is associated with rain. If I sing it with intensity, it will produce the rain. So it may go through that window of the consciousness. But if you look at the essential process, you could actually, as you sing, reach out and make the contact and invoke, and the rain would still happen. Or in the more dramatic use of this raga, which is called the Deepa raga, the raga of the flame or lamp, they will keep an unlit lamp in front and sing until the lamp catches fire spontaneously. Where it is said that when they do that, it creates so much heat that their own body begins to heat up. So again, it's a faculty of this kind, but not focused in its operation, through the music, through the song, and so much more diffused in its working. But if you can focus it sufficiently, you don't even need the singing. But you can also do it through that. And last comment, we'll just take Jessica. Last time she had this in the chat box. She says, oh my God, I tell my chickens to roost at night with my thoughts. They run the other way when I try and nag them home with my voice. So we'll end with this, because here is your key also to communicate with animals, and generally to communicate with all beings, including subtle beings such as fairies and gnomes in the garden who may be looking after your plants. When you reach out with your voice, it is so coarse, so harsh. Your emotions behind are too crude for the sensitive beings. The fairies and gnomes, they just run away because human beings are so coarse. They're repulsive even. And for the animals, they experience intense fear because of the emotion and the coarseness of your emotions. You said, come back home, just that is too crude. But when you reach out from within your heart with your thought, with a softness and affection that they appreciate. But even that, if you've purified enough, then slowly they can begin to come and touch. If there's a strong psychic influence, that is what they feel comfortable with. They're very, very fine and sensitive, and even the chickens in that way. So if you build a relationship with them, gradually they learn to trust, and on that level, they're much more receptive to your call and command, and they understand. But when you speak out, the voice and the coarseness of that makes them run away in fear. You become very quiet, feel them close to you, and in the affinity, as you would hold a child, in that consciousness, you embrace and call them and put the suggestion, now you need to do this. So with the animals, remember, they live in a consciousness which is not rational. So word, logic, structure does not mean anything. They live in an emotional, sentimental consciousness. So the direction that the emotional sentiment flows is what they catch in the communication. So for you, it's a skill to be able to drop to that level, feel them on that level, and then suggest on that level, but softly, gently, lovingly. There are two ways. One is you hold them and turn in this way, or if you use the principle of prakamya, you feel yourself inside them and feel what you would want them to feel gently to want to go home. And then you leave behind that suggestion as you disconnect. I'm showing two variations in the variations of the Vyapti and Prakamya process. But try it out. If you have a pet, you can play with this and see how they respond. I think we'll close for today with this. There's much more that we're going to look at next. In particular, having understood how this operates, we will look at further nuances of these particular siddhis that Sri Aurobindo documents. And then we will look at examples of how he himself sees their working in the disciples, because he's awakening that perception in the disciples. And then in his own consciousness, how they're operating after a few years of having worked on this. In 3 years already, he's operating on global events and influencing things there. So we'll see all that. Hopefully that we'll have enough time next time to take this up. But look back at the working of the Siddhis. Look back at Mother's comments that she had to say. Sri Aurobindo was using all the time the intervention of miracles in the mind. And even today, he continues to do this in us, if only we open our consciousness and allow that influence to act in us. And the mother and Sri Aurobindo both. So even the awakening of this capacity within us is as if imprinted by them and awakened in us and through us in their working in the world. If you think in such terms, you won't get carried away by the vanity, pride, and those issues. And as you open and dissolve your sense of separateness, open to their larger, wider, freer, diviner consciousness, the natural working of these faculties becomes spontaneous, and they grow also quite smoothly without any heavy mixtures to begin with. When you find something happening, you observe, you smile, you say, wow, this is interesting. And then you open the part in which the experience took place to the mother and say, here, you purify this, you perfect it. And that would be the superior way in the sadhana, even to purify and perfect these capacities. So let's put ourselves in this alignment of the priority of the sadhana. These powers are not to be pursued for their own sake, Sri Aurobindo says, but developed or allowed to develop as part of the flower of divine perfection, which is by God's grace blossoming out in us. And it is this on which we concentrate. The whole process of the integral yoga and the limbs and the facets are like a flower with many petals. So we let the whole movement open consciously and participate consciously, assisting, participating, amplifying where necessary. Namaste.